This is WXOJLP Northampton, 103.3 FM, your Valley Free radio station. Welcome. I'm Warno Desgillette, and this is A Baha'i Perspective. A Baha'i Perspective is a radio program that examines contemporary issues based on the principles of the Baha'i faith. Today I'm playing a pre-recorded interview with Mr. Ash Hartwell, a Baha'i from Amherst, Massachusetts. Ash has traveled to many countries in Africa, including Egypt, Ghana, Uganda, and Malawi, applying learning principles to classroom, school, and community programs. Since he returned to the U.S. after working 25 years in Africa, he has served as an education advisor to USAID's Africa Bureau, as well as to UNICEF, CARE, and the World Bank. He has served on the Board of Trustees of the 21st Century Learning Initiative, a transnational program to synthesize the best of research and development into the nature of human learning and implications for education, work, and the development of communities worldwide. In 2002, he joined the faculty at the Center for International Education at the University of Massachusetts, where he focuses on learning in post-conflict situations, educational policy and planning, and alternative forms of education. He also continues as an advisor on education systems for the Global Learning Group of the Education Development Center, Inc. The stories that Ash has to tell are too many to capture in 1 hour, so I've segmented our interview into 3 parts. In the first segment, Ash described his experiences as one of the first Peace Corps volunteers and his adventures in Ethiopia for that assignment. Ash concluded that segment by describing his experience as an educator in the Washington, D.C. school system and the start of the Upward Bound organization. In this segment, Ash continues his journey by describing how he ended up in Amherst, Massachusetts.
Trish and I were married.
Mm-hmm.
We met at Howard Graduate School, actually. We were I saw her after meeting her in Ethiopia. We had been out of touch, and I saw her in a registration line at Howard University. And she was easy to pick out because there weren't very many white folks in the registration lines. So she was taking courses in Afro-American literature, too. So anyway... after we were married, we had a kind of a choice to make. I had an offer of going back and working for something called Teachers in East Africa, and I really loved that opportunity, or going to graduate school. And at about the time we were trying to make a decision, which, in the true 60s fashion, we used the I Ching.
Yeah, familiar.
We actually found yarrow stalks and went through the whole thing. And we came up with a very, as you often do in the I Ching, a kind of a ambiguous kind of... It's the book of changes, after all, and it's always about transition, so you're not quite sure where you're coming from and where you're going in terms of what it says. But it says that if you want to achieve change in the world, you have to have authority. Well, what in the world did that mean? I have an idea now, but anyway. About that time, I got a call from a friend who had known me in Peace Corps and then in the Cardozo Project, who was at a place in Amherst, Massachusetts at the university, saying that the School of Education was being reorganized, and there was a dean who had just come on named Dwight Allen, who wanted to interview me, and would I come up for 2 days to be a consultant about a graduate program. I thought, hey, to be a consultant? Why not? You know, how bad can that be? And so I met Dwight Allen, who was... how can I put it? He was just my kind of person. He was so open and so enthusiastic about a new vision for how you'd create education, and that it was possible to transform schools of education. Meanwhile, sharing with me cases of tab that he downed at a high rate, and enormously engaging and imaginative. And I basically came away from that, came back to Trish and said, I've met the most incredible person and this most incredible opportunity. He said, come to graduate school and design your own. Sounds right to me. I did when I was in primary school. Why shouldn't I be able to do it now? And there are a group of people who all want to do international education, whatever that might be. What about... And so we decided to come up here and had a fabulous 4 years. And at the end of that, and did a lot of the things that we wanted to, really. But at the end of that, I had an offer from Makerere University in Uganda. Well, I've been looking for something like this to go and teach at the university there. While we were here, we met more of these people called Baha'is. And there was a graduate seminar that I was in, and it was about how, again, it was a time of optimism, a time you could think that, independence was coming in Africa, had come in many cases. You could think of a new age in terms of the politics, the post-colonial, the whole education. And we're sitting around a table looking at the likelihood of being able to establish a really major innovations and reforms in the education system. And two of the people around the table seemed to me particularly thoughtful in the kinds of critical questions they asked about power relationships, about the degree to which the post-colonial European and American world were ready to take certain actions.
Mm-hmm.
And after the class, and I had been very, as you can guess, I talk easily, so I talk a lot, sometimes. I don't always, but anyway, I had been talking a lot about all the possibilities in the class. And these two guys came up to me. One was Afro-American and the other was Bob Walker, who had a beard down to his chest and seemed to be kind of a very wise person. Mm-hmm. And they said to me, do you really think that with the liberal agendas and the way things are going, that these kinds of changes are going to come? And in fact, the Afro-American, he looked at me so intensely at this, I kind of withered, and I said, in my heart of hearts, I really try to make myself believe this will happen, but I don't. I think something else is. And they both said, they said, well, have you heard about the Baha'i faith? I said, what does that have to do with it? And I began to go to a series of firesides. By the way, it was Bob Walker, who later went to Brazil, and Robert Henderson, who is now the Secretary
of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is here in the United States.
Was in graduate school at that time, along with Billy Roberts, and they actually came and lived in Belchertown, where we were living for a while. But a whole series of firesides began to make me realize that the fundamental premise of improvement of the well-being in the world has to be based on a sense of unity which goes beyond just political or economic concern or tolerance, but goes to the acceptance of the fundamental unity of our being, that we really are one family. We are all connected organically, and that without that, the various measures that people make are either philanthropic do-goodism, which is kind of a handout and doesn't deal with the structural issues, or isn't fully sincere, because if we are taking more out than we are putting in a fundamental way, we're not going to solve the problems, the structural problems of power and the economy in the world. And it's something much more radical that's needed. As another good friend who teaches history and African studies at Mount Holyoke, Holly Hansen says, we have to develop an economy of love. And what she means by that is that economics is a study, among other things, of transactions, of relationships. And we think of it in terms of material terms, but there's also social conventions that are built into that. And her observation is that much of economics that grew out of the experience of what we very loosely call the colonial period became an economics of exploitation and extraction. And that we haven't gotten over that, however we would like to believe we have. And because in many societies, we have the economics of sacrifice. The person who is the most highly respected and the most powerful in a community is the one who gives the most, not the one who takes the most. The potlatch community, these are called. That's the term that is given to communities and cultures where they value giving more than accumulation.
What's it called again?
Potlatch. And it's actually an Indian word from the Northwest Indian groups which do this. But during the period of colonialism and to some extent even in the feudal European traditions, the notion of accumulation and therefore exploitation become the primary value of human relationships. Not the primary, but a very important one, certainly in economics. And what Holly points out is that when we get to the point where we recognize that the people involved in transactions are fully human and are part of our family, then we will look towards material exchanges that are based on love rather than accumulation. And I find that very, very insightful as a way of thinking about what the world needs to move towards. So, anyway, that's a
okay. So, so let's move on to you got your doctorate.
Got my doctorate,
and you ran into the Baha'is.
I ran into the
started
Baha'is,
to make sense to you,
right? And decided to go to Uganda.
Okay.
After consultations, that said Uganda would be a good place if to go as a Baha'i. Now, Baha'is don't go as missionaries. We're not. We go to when we go to a country, we look to see how we can be of service, particularly professionally. And we don't depend on anybody's support for us. We have to support ourselves, and we do it through the work we do. So, anyway, the offer to go to Makerere University seemed like a good one, and Uganda was a place both Trish and I had visited, and the chance of teaching at the university and working there seemed to be. Really,
and how long you were there?
For 8 years. Now, as we were stepping on the airplane to go, Trish's brother, Peter, was late to see us off and came just as we were getting ready to go onto the plane and said, Uganda is undergoing a serious problem here. Idi Amin has taken over, and he has just announced that he's kicking out all of the Indians, and this is causing a lot of news and turmoil. That broke the day we got on the airplane.
Oh boy!
So we arrived in Uganda to a time of huge turmoil, and where Idi Amin was.
Was he anti-Western?
Yeah. Well, he was anti anybody who posed any sort of a threat or barrier to his own ends, which were to control the country, absolutely. A little history, because Idi Amin, like other characters who make their way onto the world scene as madmen, tyrants, and so forth, it's never so simple. Idi Amin's story goes back to the end, at the closing years of the 19th century, actually.
Really?
Yes, when Catholics and Episcopalians were, as missionaries, had established themselves in Kampala under the with the permission of the king of the Baganda people, who was known as the Kabaka, and they had started some skirmishes, first verbal and then semi-military, and were shooting at each other. A little war starting up, and there was an adventurer. There are a lot of these Victorian adventurers, Burton, and this guy was Lugard.
Okay.
Lugard, and he went to Parliament and said this would be really a disaster if the two religious communities got into serious warfare, splitting up the kingdom, and this wouldn't be good for us. Wouldn't be good for the faith. Wouldn't be good for. I propose to go and help settle this. Can you give me some funds to do that? And the Parliament agreed with that. They saw themselves as it was the white man's burden time, really. I mean, it was the idea that the empire really had a responsibility for preventing this kind of thing happening, especially when it was being done by Europeans. So they sent Lugard off. He arrived in Kampala, and sure enough, there was gunfights and there were things going on. And he then wrote to get a little more money, which he did get, to figure a way of putting this fight down. And he got enough money. He went up to the southern Sudan, the place where there has been so much trouble, the southern Sudan, near the area of what is now Juba. And there was an Englishman who had converted to Islam, Pasha, Ismail Pasha, his name was, which is a kind of a title, but it was he had a bit of a kingdom that he had formed, and he had trained troops. And Lugard took about 2,000 of the southern Sudanese troops and marched down with them back to Kampala, and needless to say, put this thing down. Not only that, built a big fort for the Kabaka, built a big fort which then became the... he didn't send these men back, but they became a permanent garrison for the Kabaka, and they signed an agreement called a protectorate, which would mean that UK would guarantee security for the Kabaka and the kingdom in exchange for full access and trade. And that became the protectorate. The southern Sudanese, with their own language, they were basically mercenaries. And they stayed on, and the next generation stayed on. They formed a community of its own language, of its own, which was a mercenary community, which formed the core of the Ugandan army at independence. Of course it did. Other Northerners had joined this, and it was a northern army. It was an army of people who had little regard for and didn't speak the language of the people,
yeah.
and saw themselves as. By then, you couldn't say mercenaries, but certainly they saw themselves as like an occupying force, which meant that any politician had to be on their side, and any politician that stepped out of line a little or didn't go along with them, they could get rid of. And they did. And that's what happened. When Obote, the first president of the country, became a little bit of a tyrant, he was totally depending on them and finally said, we don't need him. And Amin was then the virtual head of this group, of the army. And that's what happened. So he didn't come out of nowhere, and all the behavior and so forth actually reflected this group of third generation Southern Sudanese who essentially looted the country and then went back to Southern Sudan, where they have continued to fuel the ongoing unrest and problems there. So that's important to understand, because it shows why there's continued problems in northern Uganda, southern Sudan, and so on. It's this started way back.
Yeah. So
I
you
taught
walk
at
off the
university.
plane into Uganda.
Right, and are picked up by one of the Baha'is who met us at the airport, luckily, and we had 3 kids by then. We adopted twins at birth, and so we had 3 kids, all below the age of 3, and a 3-year-old and twins of 4.5. Was she that old? It was 1968, yeah. Okay, correction. They seem pretty young.
Yeah.
So
you had a young family.
Young family. We were given a house, quite a nice house, by the university. But our guard, and there were other houses like it around us. It was a ways from the university, and it was an area where there were some other university people. But we were told that it was not very secure area. There were robberies, and our guard showed up with a bow and arrow. It didn't look like he could shoot anything very well. Shortly after we got into our house, we noticed a button by the bed and thought, was that for the overhead lights or what is it for? And we put on the we pushed the button. Nothing happened. And about a minute later, we kind of, what was that for? And about a minute later, we start hearing this siren. And it sounds like it's somewhere else, but it's actually a siren that we turned on in our house. And it got so loud before we realized that was us. It didn't. Nobody responded to it, but it turned out that this was not a safe area, and so we were then moved into an apartment on the university. We had a hard time. One of our first trips out to visit a community and friends for the Baha'i community. We were going to Tororo, which was a drive about 2.5 hours east at a place called Tororo on the border with Kenya. And as we were going off on this trip, before we got out of Kampala, we were stopped by a set of soldiers who told us that we shouldn't move and that we should just turn around and go back, that something had happened, and that we weren't allowed to go forward. And we tried to beg and plead, and they wouldn't let us go. So we started. But we asked them, well, is there any place we could go to get permission? And they said, yeah, you could go up to this Lugar prison, which is a mile away or so. And we were very naive and didn't realize that this was a high-security prison where they put political as well. I mean, it was not a place you go and visit. And, so we drive up to see if we could get permission, and we're surrounded by really angry-looking guys with semi-automatics and guns, and they shout, "Get out!" And they're speaking Swahili, which I didn't speak then. They actually put me on the ground flat.
Oh my!
I have a gun on my head, and our kids are dancing around on the hot. It was hot pavement, and they were saying, what's happening to Dad, and don't. And finally, I got across that I needed to speak to the commandant, the senior person who came out and did speak English, and I explained to him, I'm at the university, I was on an innocent trip, and I was told to come here to get permission. How about it? Didn't look very likely, and he just kind of, one of these really stupid Mazungus. Go home. Don't pass go. Don't go home. So we went home. It turned out that this was all because there had been an invasion into the southern part of the country by a combination of Rwandese and Ugandan exiles, so who were trying to come in.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh. All right. So you went back to the university.
So, actually, we were just thinking about, so what kind of response does one have to this? Being, actually boots on my back, a rifle at the head, Amin's regime clearly out of control, things starting to deteriorate. We, our family, my family, Trish and I, consulted at some length and said, this is where we ought to be. We're not going to be able to get out around the country, but, we felt that there were very few Europeans who wanted to stay around then. And we wanted to stay around because we wanted to kind of demonstrate that we recognize in the world that there are these horrors, but as a Baha'i, that in the long run, the sense that everybody here, even those who are perpetrators, are human beings who have a soul, who have a spirit, who are to be recognized. This world is not an easy one that we live in, and there's no reason to escape because there may be some personal danger. Fact is, the fear of personal hurt never really was very prominent, even during these times. Trish turned out to be the one who saved us from a lot of grief in Uganda. We were... I couldn't survive on the university salary, by the way. Inflation was about 250%, and I was being paid in local currency. Everybody was having trouble. Ugandans had farms often to go to help. I didn't. And I was offered a position with the United Nations that grew out of some of the research I was doing with the university about a rural education program to become an advisor of the planning department of the Ministry of Education. And I'd been doing work with them, looking at how this particular program could be expanded. It was a program that integrated the agriculture and the sociology of local communities into teacher training, and made the university somewhat service-oriented, outreach programs into the communities, and then spread that out to schools and made that a part of the curriculum. And that was going very well, but for a variety of reasons. So this offer, after 2 years, made it possible for us to stay on, because I think economically we were just we started out making something like what would be the equivalent of about $900 a month, and after 2 years it was worth about $250. So, it was really getting tough. So that was a decision that was made, but it was also that we had a very vibrant Baha'i community and UN community, and there was overlap between the two. Uganda is one of the countries where the Baha'is worldwide have contributed to have what is called a house of worship. And the house of worship is... it has 9 entrances, each representing a faith tradition, and is a place where people from all faiths are invited to come for prayer. It has no sermons in it. It is just for prayer and meditation. And it is an absolutely stunning building. You can view it from Kampala up on a hill called Kakaya, about 8 miles out of town. And it has absolutely stunning gardens, rays of bougainvillea and lovely tropical plants radiating out from each of the doorways. And the community in Uganda itself of Baha'is was very dedicated, wonderful group. One of my best friends, Inaso Piero, was re-entered the university at the age of 68 and finished his degree at the age of 72. He had been a teacher. Wonderful. We had also the incredible opportunity of having Enoch Olinga, who is one of the people within the Baha'i faith worldwide who is appointed to be a hand of the cause, which is a special title for those who are absolutely dedicated champions of the faith. And Enoch Olinga had been one of the first people to from Africa to move to pioneer and to live in another country. He went to Cameroon, and then later was appointed by Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the faith, as the hand of the cause. And Enoch was when he walked into a room. People, when they walk into a room, you kind of glance at them and you say, you have a judgment.
Right.
There's a new book out by a guy named Malcolm Gladwell called Blink. I highly recommend it.
Okay.
It shows how we make immediate judgments about all kinds of things on our very almost instantaneous impression. Well, Enoch Olinga, when he walked into a room, what happened? Joy was the response. He just radiated this kind of just this personality that was so in love with the world and everybody in it that it just radiated. He radiated joy, and he made everybody feel good. So he was in Uganda and stayed there during this period, and gatherings at his house and times with his family were just so special because whatever horrors were taking place, and there were horrors taking place. The dark side of the world, the dark forces that were balanced by, not balanced, but kind of overcome by this sense that, there are ways that we as human beings are able to rise to transcend this, and it's going to happen. We had this deep sense that that's going to work.
So you felt it from him.
And we felt that so strongly.
Yeah.
Incidentally, even during much of the Amin period, although the faith was formally banned, the house of worship maintained itself as a symbol of kind of hope for the country. And from time to time, it would be, you'd see it in the national newspaper, even when the faith itself was banned.
And why was it banned?
It was banned because during the time of Amin, radical Islamic movements from Saudi Arabia and Libya saw Uganda as an opportunity to gain a much stronger foothold in Uganda. And because Amin was ostensibly a Muslim, although he violated most of the tenets of Islam. He, at one time, when I was still at the university, he invited Muhammad Gaddafi down to establish
Muammar Gaddafi, the leader
of Libya.
Yeah,
well known for its support of terrorist movements and so forth. He invited Gaddafi down to officially open a faculty of revolution, and Gaddafi did come down, and somehow the people who had briefed him hadn't let him know that 90% of the country in Uganda was strong Christians, and that about 10% were Islam. And he gave the opening address for this faculty of revolution at the university, and a lot of people came out of curiosity, and he supposed they were all true believers. And the talk began at about 4:30 or so, and was in Arabic and was translated. And within an hour, as the sun was going down, people just started fading away because Gaddafi was making the case that Christianity had really ruined Africa, and Islam was the way forward. Whatever the merit of that case, he wasn't speaking to sympathetic ears, and it was really odd because he didn't seem to notice, and that by the time the talk ended, it was dark, and they hadn't turned on the lights. And at the very end of the talk, they turned on the lights, and there were about 8 people around. It was just a case of complete misunderstanding. But one of the conditions that we understood, it was never, I don't have official proof of this, but I have pretty strong from one of the high officials in government, was that Libya put the condition on Uganda, if they were to receive its aid, they should ban the faith.
Because the Muslims consider the Baha'is
of heretics.
Heretics.
Yeah. The Baha'is have been persecuted by by Islam since the time basically of its birth in the mid 19th century, and it's led to not only banning of the faith's activities but jailing of its leaders and its
So where
leaders.
did this put you all if the faith was banned? I mean,
well, we weren't able to hold official functions and meetings, but we met as family all over.
Mm-hmm.
But we weren't able to go and hold open
Public
meetings,
proclamations or
public
anything.
meetings,
Yeah.
Nonetheless, the Baha'i stayed in touch with each other and held meetings, but just not officially.
Okay.
Yeah, and stayed in close contact. Interestingly enough, when Amin was finally overthrown, and this didn't take place until '79.
And so we
were there.
You were still there.
We were there. Yeah.
So you were there when he was instituted, and you were there when he.
Well, we came in after he had taken over, but before the nature of his regime became clear. We arrived in the early months of his takeover. And interestingly enough, when he took over, there was jubilation in the streets because the former leader, Obote, had been seen to become increasingly tyrannical and so
if only they
at
knew.
First, yeah, right. It's but
so 79 he was
79 when the country, as it were, was liberated and then went into 10 years of civil war. But on the front page of the newspaper, very large, was the Baha'i House of Worship.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and saying that this was a symbol that had been maintained through all these periods, and people looked towards it, and it was the symbol of the unity and the sense that things would be better. It was interesting that even during the time that the faith was banned, Amin himself and many of his top people came to visit the House of Worship. We always had people there and kept it up. So it's hard to know, but it had a draw.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't refuse the spirit.
Right. Yeah.
So, how much longer were you in Uganda after that?
Well, conditions deteriorated after the overthrow of Amin. There was an occupation of the Tanzanian, what was called an army, most of the army being youth who had been recruited, given a uniform and a gun and sent north. So they were a pretty unruly bunch, but they were the occupying group. And then Uganda struggled through a whole series of governments. I was still with the UN, and the UN officially evacuated everyone towards the end of '79. And the reason is that, one, the head of the UNDP had been shot and killed on a roadside by roadside bandits as he was driving outside of Kampala. There had been a number of kidnaps and killings. UN could no longer guarantee any security. When Amin's people left his army, they sometimes traded support to travel with guns. They had left arms all over the country. Those arms had gone underground, and it was a mess. There was absolutely no security in the country, and the fact that he left didn't solve anything. Actually, it just reemerged the prior antagonisms and problems. And so the country really struggled for a long time. I went back a few times during the civil wars and conflicts to see if we could do anything in education, but couldn't.
It was difficult.
So we traveled. We waited for about 4 or 5 months. No, not that long, I guess. About 3 months in Nairobi, waiting to see what might happen. Also, after we were evacuated, we then Trish was able to go back into Kampala to see what we could salvage of our belongings. Our house had been looted, as many others, and we went around to the neighbors, and they told us what they had been able to rescue.
That's
Now
sweet.
they would have kept it, and we let them keep some of the things, but some of the things meant a lot to us.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I was married, Trish gave me a guitar as a wedding present. And that guitar, it just wasn't any old guitar. And we found that, minus its strings, in one of the neighbors' houses, and said, that one means a lot. I claimed that one back. So, but we lost everything, actually. Had a library. We lost pretty much everything. In the Baha'i faith, every 19 years, I think you're supposed to clear out and start again. You're supposed to kind of clear out your material belongings, and this wasn't quite 19 years, but it sure did the trick. And it was interesting because we really lost everything and had to start over, and we had to think about what do we really need and what don't we, and what means something. So.
But at some point, I guess you felt you couldn't go back after that while you were waiting those 3 months in Nairobi.
Well, there was no...
you were sort of waiting to see if you could, and
yeah, I mean, I was working with the UN, and finally the UN said no more.
Yeah.
We can't wait anymore, and I had nothing to go back to. I couldn't. I mean, there was no economy. There was no. Everything was pretty much in shambles, and so we had to. We came back. Actually, we came back here to Amherst. Stayed with friends, the Rothsteins, actually. At that time. Our kids went into school here at Marks Meadow. While we were waiting to see what next. And I was still officially employed by UNESCO. So they were waiting to see what other assignment would pop up. And the next thing that popped up was Lesotho. So let me take a break. So we found ourselves headed to the mountain kingdom of Lesotho. Lesotho... You probably don't know this. Something very special about Lesotho. It's the highest country in terms of average elevation in the world. And everything. What? What about the Himalayas?
Yeah, I was going to say,
What about
Nepal,
Bhutan?
right?
I mean, give me a break. Sikkim, it's way up. But they all have deep valleys. Lesotho has valleys, but the country starts at 7,000 feet and goes up to about just under 13,000, and it's all mountain. There's nothing else except mountain. It is the mountain kingdom. The traditional culture there, actually, it's a very interesting country in the sense that it was formed as a response to civil wars, social conflict that scarred the northern half of South Africa during the second half of the 19th century. The Zulu were moving south and were kind of inexorable in terms of their ability just to take over areas because they had developed a certain kind of militia that was just unstoppable. On one hand, and the Voortrekkers, the Dutch farmer warriors, were moving north. And as these two groups moved towards each other, they displaced villages, towns and villages, all through the central part of South Africa. And these people were like displaced people. They had to go somewhere. There was no UN refugee place, and they headed to the mountains as a refuge. And different groups congregated in the area which is now the lowlands of Lesotho, but was then, of course, the highlands from the plains around, from different groups. And these groups settled on the mesa, the flat hills in the lower part of what is now Lesotho. And one in particular, one mesa, was a chief emerged called Mishweshwe. And he was a most remarkable character. He had all the characteristics of what I would call a Baha'i leader. His fundamental point was there was no way the people could survive unless they worked together as one group. And although they came from different ethnicities and languages and so forth, it was really important for them to treat each other as one family. And to do that, he actually promoted the use of one of the languages, Sesotho, and that became the national language. And today, 99% of the people in the country speak that language, which is interesting in Africa. It's one of the few countries where everybody speaks one language. And Mshweshwe he persuaded missionaries to establish stations along the Caledon River, which is the river that marked the boundary, as it were, of his area, so that they would present, as it were, an obstacle to the Voortrekkers, the people coming north. And so Mshweshwe became the first king, and a very wise man he was, able to have people transcend their differences in settling their disputes, and really teaching that the unity of these peoples was essential to their survival, and it created the nation. So that was an interesting part of history, and I've always thought Mshweshwe should be one of the leaders that we study, but probably nobody who's listening to this, unless they've lived in Lesotho, or unless you're a Masutu, actually know about Mshweshwe, one of the unsung heroes and leaders of the world. We lived in Lesotho for almost 5 years. I had the wonderful opportunity to serve on the National Assembly in Uganda and in Lesotho.
So that's the National Governing Council for the Baha'is.
Right, yeah. And it's elected every year with a secret ballot, and people elect those who they feel can serve best. And so it has no... It's an assembly that is is constituted by the will of the people. But during my time there, at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel, the completion of the edifice, which is the seat of the House of the Universal House of Justice, which is a elected 9-member body that is the authoritative body of the Baha'i world. That election took place while I was on the National Assembly, and members of the National Assembly have the great honor and bounty of traveling to the World Center to do this election. And we went there just as this fabulous building, you can go on the web and see this, was completed, and people came from about 130 countries, and representing every language and ethnicity and culture in the world. It was just an amazing gathering on Mount Carmel, and in the Old Testament, both Isaiah and Micah have this promise that the people will come from all parts of the world and walk the paths of the Lord on the Holy Mountain. And here we were, walking the paths of the Holy Mountain. So that just, as I'll say, it blew me away. And that has been a absolutely defining event in my life to recognize the vision of what the world can be, because it was there. The not just joy, the exaltation we all felt in the gardens and at this time was wonderful. After Lesotho, we worked there very happily for 5 years, and then had an offer in a neighboring country across South Africa. And you associate this country with the Kalahari Desert, perhaps, and it's Botswana. And Botswana, again, quite different from Lesotho in the sense that most of it's a desert. But it has a couple of interesting features. One is that In the north of the country, the Angola River, which is a really major river in Africa, and African rivers are really major, finds its way south to the north of Botswana, the north of the Kalahari Desert, where it breaks up into a delta of islands in the desert. And this is called the Okavango. And the Okavango is truly one of the natural wonders of the world, one of the biological wonders of the world. It has the greatest number of bird species in the world in one concentrated place. The islands have small palms and bushes and things, and many of them now have, the bigger ones have a place you can stay, camps. The water is so clear that you can see 10 to 15 feet down as if you're looking through a magnifying glass to the bottom. And there are fish and animals. The place is just teeming with game. The Angola River spreads out into the delta and during the flooding time, during the period of the rains. And then during the dry season, it contracts, and when it contracts, the animals get into more and more concentration on the islands. And so you come during the dry season there, you have the highest concentration of birds and games anywhere in the world. And you don't have too many in the way of lions and predators. You do have some leopards, but boy, the antelope and the buffalo and so forth are they're just outside your window.
Oh my!
So that. Our kids and we enjoyed much visiting there. It was wonderful. I think from Botswana, I want to go to a different kind of place. One other thing though about Botswana, on the teaching trips that we were able to make into the Kalahari, we would often stay on the pans, and the pans are depressions in the desert. When it rains during the rainy season, they fill up with water, but they empty with water pretty quickly, but they leave salt residue behind often. And around the pans you find concentrations of antelope, and in particular springbok, which are small, very energetic antelope. They're only about four feet tall, but they are really energetic. And when we camped on the pans, they encircle us. And if you shine a light, they get quite close, like about 20 yards, 30 yards away, and in a perfect circle around us. And then if you come out and shine a light, they back off. But in proportion, so that the circle kind of contracts and expands, depending on whether or not you're standing outside the tent or in it. And like a herd of these things will be maybe 100 of them, gosh. Just and it's just uncanny. And there's some kind of communication going on there. They are so sensitive to your movement and so on. But the other thing the reason you're going out to the pans is we met and interacted with the Bushmen, the San people, the little people, and the San are one of the remaining traces of what really are the original peoples of the continent of Africa. They once were the predominant group of people on the continent, and there's evidence of the San up in North Africa, through Central Africa, and in South Africa. They are hunter-gatherers. They live a way of life which our great ancestors lived. They are enormous. They are very short. They're only 4 feet tall. They have a golden skin, something very different. Not Negroid, not Asiatic, it's golden skin. And they are very funny. I mean, they like to play jokes. And even though they now are at the last stages of the way of life as they have known it for millennium, they are enormously playful and welcoming. Oh my goodness! You go to one of their camps and they can't get enough of you. They just are so welcoming and so happy to see you, and yet they have suffered intensely because they have been moved. They no longer have a way of life that they can live. They've been forced by drought and the restriction of their range to live in small areas. But boy, they will come up to you and embrace you.
Wow.
I mean, and will chatter on, and their language, of course, is absolutely magnificent. It's a language of
Clicks
sounds,
and stuff.
of the clicks.
Yeah.
Some of that language has found its way into the languages of Setswana and Sesotho and other languages in the area. And some of the places are, one of my favorite places is called Golosing.
Say that again.
Say that again. Golosing. It took a while. It took a lot of sand on my palate to be able to get that right. And the Kalahari offers lots of that. But they are absolutely wonderful people. I don't know how many people are listening here have ever seen a movie called The Gods Must Be Crazy, which is done as a kind of a caricature of the Bushmen, but in fact some of the values that it shows that they have are in truth there. This intense sense of communal concern in life, that the gods must be crazy because a Coke bottle is thrown out of an airplane at about 20,000 feet and lands in the sands next to one of the camps of the Bushmen. And they go out and pick it up, and it looks very interesting. It came out of the sky. It must have come from the gods. What is it? But the problem with this thing is it starts to cause disputes because there's only one of it. And the Bushmen cannot understand what happened because the gods have always given them more than one of something. They've always given them plenty to share. And so they think the gods must be crazy. So the movie is about returning this thing to the gods because something is wrong. Doesn't that tell us a lot about the way they view material goods and how those are to be mutually enjoyed, or something is wrong with the world? That should tell us something about ourselves. And I can truly say, in meeting these people, that is not a caricature. That's the way they are. So that
Very
was,
interesting.
That was one of the experiences in Botswana.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Dr. Ash Hartwell, an educator and a Baha'i from Amherst, Massachusetts, who spent many years in Africa. If you want information specifically on the Baha'i faith, you're welcome to visit the website www.baha'i.org. That's BAHAI.org. Or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE. I hope you'll join me next time on A Baha'i Perspective.